We now continue our discussion. We have already discussed the salient features of the Indian Constitution. And one of the salient features which we have already talked about is that India is a federation. Now, lots of questions are put whether India is a true federation or not. What will be our answer? The answer is actually yes. India is a federation with strong center. It has a federal constitution with a unitary bias. Yes, the constitution has given more powers to the union government. Now let us discuss all these things in details. The most important point, one of the very important point is that India is a federation of states, and the constituent states cannot secede from the federation. That is a very important point. And our Indian federation has been made on the Canadian model, consisting of states and of union territories. There are few union territories also. Now, if we look into the constitution or the formation of a true federation, then we find that a true federation actually has certain features, namely dual government, distribution of powers between states and center, supremacy of the constitution, supremacy of the judiciary. In theory, all these characteristics are present in our federation. In India, there are two sets of government, the central government and the state governments. The states are not the mere agents of the center, and the center and the states derive their responsibilities and their powers from the constitution. Neither the union government nor the state governments can disregard the provisions of the constitution. Our constitution is a rigid one. It cannot be amended in the ordinary lawmaking process. So that it is a union of states and certain union territories. It has a central government, it has state governments, and both these governments actually derive their powers from the rules of the constitution, from the provisions of the constitution. Now another point that, and these states cannot secede from the territory of India. Another thing is that our constitution is a rigid one, like in a federal government. It cannot be amended in the ordinary lawmaking process. We talked about it when discussing the salient features of the Indian Constitution, and both the center and the state participate in the amendment of the federal provisions of the Constitution. So these are first 2 points. Third point is that the amendment of the federal provisions can be done by both the central and state governments, as I have already told you. But thirdly, the written constitution of India divides and distributes the powers, legislative, administrative and financial, between the national government and the state government. In India, the legislative powers have been divided into 3 lists. We have already discussed these things in the class, but for a revision: the central list, the state list, and the concurrent list. And in India, between state governments, between the central government and the state governments, the powers, legislative, administrative and financial, have been clearly divided. In India, the legislative powers have been divided into 3 sets. We have already discussed these things in the class. One is the central list, the other is the state list, and the concurrent list. But you know, in concurrent lists, both the state governments and the central governments can make powers, make laws. Concurrent lists are open to both the state governments and the central governments. But in theory, the central government and the state governments are actually limited. The state government has limited powers in concurrent powers, concurrent lists. If there is a conflict between a federal law and a state law on the same subject, the former will prevail over the latter. The Indian residuary power belongs to the residuary powers belong to the center. But in the USA, the state governments enjoy residuary powers. Moreover, the central government can make laws on state subjects under extraordinary circumstances. That is the case in India. For example, Parliament is empowered to enact laws on a state subject included in the state list in the national interest, and to implement international treaties or agreements. In the USA, the constituent state has separate constitution. But in India, there is only one constitution, namely the Constitution of India. The Constitution of India is also like the Constitution of states. That means there is no separate constitution for the states. The state governments perform their function within the framework of the Indian Constitution. In the USA, the Constitution is very rigid. The government plays an important role. The state governments plays an important role in the amendment of the Constitution. In Parliament, in Indian Parliament, in India, Parliament alone is empowered to change the provisions of the Constitution relating to the fundamental rights of citizens. Like the Canadian model, the governor of an Indian state is appointed by the President of India. He holds office during the pleasure of the President. Our Parliament is also empowered to alter the boundaries and names of the states without their